Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's Travel Tuesday lecture for Australians studying abroad. Throughout the course of these lectures, I have begun each talk by introducing you to a staff member from the fabulous team at ASA. And this evening, it's my very great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Tuttle, who has joined us at a most unseasonable hour. I believe it's 3 a.m. in Vermont, where he is at the moment. So thank you for waking up for us all, Chris, at this awful hour. But Chris is now ASA's new academic and outreach coordinator. So he has a very important job within the company. Chris is an archaeologist, he's a cultural heritage consultant, and he has led tours for ASA to Syria, to Jordan, and to Turkey. So welcome, Chris. Would you like to say a few words to everybody?
Hi, everybody. Very nice to meet all you intrepid ASA travelers. But yeah, so I joined, I've been with ASA off and on since 2008, I believe it was, Kristen, that I did the first tour in Syria. I'm going to be working with them on trying to help update some of the academic materials that you all get in advance of your tours, working perhaps in developing some new tours with Kristen and the team. We've sort of relaunched an effort on the social media. So if you're a Facebook person or an Instagram person, please take a look at our Facebook feed and the Instagram feed. So on Facebook, you can find us as Australians Studying Abroad, and on Instagram. So yeah, check us out. We're trying to give a lot of academic content on the social media now, more just snack-sized bits of information about the destinations where ASA's tours go, and just interesting things related to heritage, art, culture from around the world, even if ASA doesn't necessarily send a tour there, but it's interesting. So they're just a quick little read, and hopefully you can learn something new that you didn't know before. And I'll be joining you next month as your lecturer for this series. I'll be speaking about the Mediterranean coast of Turkey, which is part of the Turquoise Coast tour that has not run for ASA since 2011, I believe. So take a look at that. It's an amazing series of places that we visit on that tour. Then I'll be joining you again in September to talk about Jordan as a crossroads location in the Middle East. So looking forward to see you all then, I hope.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. And yes, I've noticed all the really interesting pieces on the ASA Facebook page, and I've very much been enjoying them. So keep up the good work, and you're providing us all with lots of really fascinating pieces to read on Facebook. So thank you very much. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce our Travel Tuesday lecturer this evening, Dr. Mindy MacLeod. Mindy goes under the fascinating title of a runologist. It sounds to me like something out of a Tolkien novel, Mindy. It's really a fascinating title to be a runologist. Mindy is a former lecturer in Swedish and Old Norse language and literature at the University of Melbourne, and she now works at the Graduate School of Education. She did a PhD at the University of Uppsala in Sweden with a prize-winning dissertation on runic writing. Now, Mindy will be leading a tour to Norway and the Lofoten Archipelago, looking at rock carvings, Ragnarök, and reindeer. Sounds a wonderful tour and a very, very attractive part of the world. So that's going to be from July to August of next year. So there are still places available on that tour. And of course, we encourage you to have a closer look at it. But tonight, Mindy's going to be giving us a talk with a really fascinating title. It's called Viking Beasties, Battle Cows, Troll Cats, and Hellhounds. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Mindy MacLeod. Thanks, Mindy.
Thank you very much. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm new to ASA, so I'm really excited to be asked to give a talk. And before I start, I just want to say that I've listened to all the other Travel Tuesday talks, and I found them really interesting, really exciting, and I learned a lot. And we're taking a tour to Norway, focusing on the idea of fabulous animals. No one is really going to Norway to see cows, dogs, or cats. But nevertheless, that's what I'm basically going to be talking about. And I'm going to throw in at the end some other animals that we might actually meet on the tour. The whole topic was chosen because it's very much an interest of mine. I'm interested in animal ornamentation from the Viking Age. I'm interested in depictions of animals that come from the post-Viking period but describe the Viking period. So actually, one of the first stops on the tour that I'm taking next year is actually to the rock carvings. And those are not Viking Age, they're Bronze Age rock carvings. But they do show the importance from, a very early time of cattle in people's mythology and as well as in their everyday life. So this rock carving is actually one of the ones we're going to see at Asperberget near the Litsleby Museum in Sweden. And we're taking a trip down from Oslo to see that. And we're also seeing this one's at Litsleby, showing the importance of cattle, not just in everyday life, but also in ritual. So before we get on to our battle cows, which I'm assuming is what people have turned in to hear about, I just want to talk about the idea of cows and cattle in Scandinavian mythology. So it's been there from a really early time. And in fact, the Norse story of creation, a cow has a very, very central place in that. So the Norse world was literally licked into shape by the primeval cow Audhumla. So she was responsible for licking the salty ice blocks that were found at the dawn of time. And the first day she licked out from the blocks a man's hair, and on the second day a man's head, and on the third day, so she's a bit quicker than some of our other creator gods, she was able to bring out Buri, who was fair of feature, great and mighty, and he was the grandfather of the Norse gods Odin, Vili, and Ve. So we have these sort of cows recurring throughout the mythology. Tacitus describes in his Germania how one of the early Norse goddesses, Nerthus, was pulled around in a chariot drawn by cows. And if you've been to Copenhagen and seen the Gefjon fountain, you're probably familiar with the myth of the goddess Gefjon, who was promised as much land in Sweden as she could plough in one day. And so she turned her sons into oxen, and they were therefore able to plough out of Sweden the whole piece of land that was then thrown into the sea and became the Danish island of Jutland. So we have these, really important stories about cows and cattle. But what I did promise was battle cows. And I think the most famous battle cow that is described in any great detail from the Viking Age, it's described in the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, who is Ragnar Fuzzy Breeches or Hairy Pants, however you want to translate that. It's a legendary saga which is written down after the Viking Age, but purports to describe things that happened during the Viking Age. And this saga describes how the King of Sweden had a fantastic cow known as Sibylla, and she received so many sacrifices that men could not withstand her bellowing. It was the king's custom when an invasion was inspected that this very same cow went in front of the ranks. So much devilry followed her that her enemies lost their senses as soon as they heard her. They fought each other and took no heed for themselves. For that reason, Sweden was never subject to invasion. And so she's described a couple of times in the saga. The saga about Ragnar Lodbrok is sort of about Ragnar as well as his sons and what they do. And so, of course, they try and invade Sweden, and then you have a description of a horrifying battle where, the cow is bellowing horribly. and goring many people, and the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok are completely unable to overcome her, although they are able to do so at a later date. So eventually it doesn't go so well for this cow. But this idea of this monstrous bellow, this cow that has this monstrous bellow, it's actually found in a number of the sagas. It's found in the saga of Eric the Red, the saga of the Greenlanders. There's a number of stories that tell about cows that scare people away with their sounds. We have the story of Ögvaldur, a legendary 7th century Norwegian king who's mentioned actually in quite a number of legendary sagas, and he owned and worshipped a sacred cow whom he always kept with him, believing he owned his victories to the power of the cow and the power of its milk, which gave him vitality and strength. And he was eventually slain by a rival king. And he and his cow were buried in separate mounds, which this is the cow's mound in Kontakoid in Norway. So we have these sort of strange tales suggesting the importance of cows and sometimes bulls or other kinds of cattle in the mythology. The saga of Hjálmþir and Olvir tells of a 90-year-old ox who feeds on human flesh and was more ferocious than any other animal. And again, it had one of those piercing, powerful voices that no one was able to withstand. And he was kept in a really strong enclosure because it was feared that if he got out, he would wreak havoc on men and livestock. And all living creatures were terrified of this creature. And we also have descriptions of a famous battle which took place in Sweden, the Battle of Fyrisvellir in probably around about the 980s, where King Eric the Victorious, and that gives you a clue as to who won the battle. King Eric the Victorious, he didn't actually have one of these magical battle cows, but he had the brilliant idea that when he was facing his nephew Styrbjörn in battle, he got the members of his army to tie swords and shields onto a herd of cows. And so he and his army sort of went into battle with this herd of untrained fighting cows. And again, this kind of, the noise and the idea of cows loaded up with all these kind of weapons was ultimately enough to give him the victory, although the fight lasted all that day and the next night. So we have these kind of stories. We have stories of oxen who are sacrificed to gods in some of the sagas, and their blood is sort of smeared around the temple and used to stain sacred rings. In Sturloik Saga, we have people sacrificing to an ox and feeding it gold and silver. One of the more well-known Icelandic sagas, Eyrbyggja saga, the saga of the dwellers of the Eyr, has quite a famous tale in it of this zombie calf. The tale itself has this century, in around 2010, it was made into a short novel, Glæsir. But in the actual Icelandic saga, the saga dates from the 13th century, but it's telling stories from the Viking Age. So it's purporting to tell stories from an earlier time. And it tells of this terrible character, Thorolf Sledgehammer, who was terribly unpopular and was eventually killed. But his ashes were licked by a cow. And then the cow then gave birth to this terrible, monstrous zombie calf who was known as Glæsir. And Glæsir was almost impossible to kill. He would impale people on his horns, he would gore them in the guts and so on. So, it's this sort of story of the calf resulting from this horrible, horrible person. And the last saga I want to mention in connection with enchanted bulls and cows is the saga of Bosi and Herod, which again is a saga which postdates the Viking Age but is set at a much, much earlier time. And it describes how a priestess of the temple is fed on a 2-year-old heifer at every meal. But it's not just any heifer. The heifer that she eats at every single meal, it has to be, well, she also keeps an enrolled bull in her temple. And so the heifer has to be sexually penetrated by the bull, who will then presumably inject some kind of poisonous magic into the cow that the priestess then consumes. So there's all of these kind of garbled stories about cows and bulls playing some kind of important part in the mythology in different ways, whether as sacrificial animals that are being sacrificed or sacrificed to, or used as kind of strange weapons of war, because cattle, of course, is not what you'd immediately think of when you are thinking of something to defend your country. But it's a recurring theme throughout some of the sagas. And we're going to stay with the saga of Bosi and Herod for the next topic, which was hellhounds. Because in the same saga, in this saga, there's a very, very long curse chanted by the old woman Busla, who is the foster mother of one of the main characters, Bosi. So she gives this long curse, and the end of this curse, I've just put the end of this curse up. She refers to hounds of hell. Then hounds from hell shall harry you, and your soul sink into torment. And this whole curse, Busla's curse, it's parts of it are found repeated on runic inscriptions that do date from the Viking age. It's also been given a new lease of life in the 21st century. You'll find quite a number of Scandinavian death metal bands that are interested in the pagan past have sort of given their own interpretations of this curse. So Heilung, who were here earlier this year, they were playing in Melbourne, and they're a really well-known Norse folk group that draws heavily on the past, and they've got a version of Busla's curse. Another one that you can find online is by Golden Core, where they sort of sing through. So if you're interested in sort of listening to a modern reinterpretation of some of the stuff that you find in the sagas, it's quite interesting to listen to that. Heilung, for example, calls itself an amplified history. So they're drawing on things that are often documented in the sources, but of course, presented in a 21st century light. So we have this idea of the hounds from hell, or more usually just one. More usually it's just one hound from hell. In the collection of poetry known as the Edda, the Poetic Edda, we have a poem called Baldur's Dreams. And in that poem, the Norse god Odin goes down to hell. He's worried about what might happen to his son, and he goes down to hell. And hell is a person. She's guardian of the underworld, but it's also a place. The place that she guards is known as hell. And he goes down there, and you have this poem describing how on the way he encounters the hound of hell. Then Odin rose, the enchanter old, and the saddle he laid on Sleipnir's back. Sleipnir is his horse. Thence rode he down to Niflheim deep, and the hound he met that came from hell. Bloody he was on his breast before. At the father of magic he howled from afar. Forward rode Odin. The earth resounded till the house so high of hell he reached. So this idea of this sort of hellhound that howls at various events is, again, one that recurs in some of the mythology. Some Norse sources refer to the hellhound as being called Garm. He's described as the worst of monsters, and his howling is often said to herald the coming of Ragnarök, the Norse Apocalypse, the end of the world. Another poem that you find in the Poetic Edda, that same collection of old Scandinavian poetry, that a lot of which probably dates from the Viking age, although again it wasn't written down till later. It tells you that now Garm howls loud before Kniperhetlir, the fetters will burst and the wolf run free. Much do I know and more can I see of the fight of the gods, the mighty in fight. So we have these descriptions of the Hound of Hell, and the dog Garm is supposed to fight with the god Tyr at Ragnarök. And he's often assumed to be a kind of doublet of the terrible, monstrous wolf Fenrir. So we have a lot of Norse mythology that describes how the terrible wolf Fenrir will bring about the end of the world. He will swallow the god Odin, as you can see depicted there. And it's often assumed that Garm, the Hound of Hell, is a kind of doublet of him, and maybe a later creation arising through misunderstanding. Like wolves play a big part in Ragnarök, in the Norse end of the world. They're described as swallowing the sun and moon, swallowing Odin, one of the chief gods. The whole idea of the wolf is the idea of lawlessness and the loss of humanity. And Ragnarök, the Norse end of the world, is described as, you know, a wolf age, an axe age, a sword age, a wind age, a wolf age. The wolves sort of live on the periphery of society. And sometimes the dogs are associated with them, but not always. So dogs, of course, were also just, you know, faithful companions, and a lot of people kept dogs in the Viking age. They were kept, you know, for herding, they were kept for hunting, they were kept for companionship and pets. And much like if you're watching a Nordic noir series today and one of the main characters has a dog, it's often not a good sign. You know something terrible is going to happen to that dog, and it probably won't see the series out. And that's often the same kind of thing in the sagas. You often have this dog where you know, oh no, it's not going to go well for the dog. There's an expression that recurs in some of the sagas, ur hundaljóðum, which is out of range of dog barking. So people very much associated, if they were planning an attack on a farm or something, they had to make sure that they prepared themselves out of the range of dog barking, because they knew that that would alert the farm owners to their coming. So we see dogs used in hunting. There were also different kinds of fighting dogs in the age of migrations just before the Viking period. They found in some of the burial mounds spiked collars and leashes that indicate the presence of hunting dogs. And of course, they've also found, you know, the bones of dogs along with other slaughtered animals. So one of the chief protagonists of Njál's saga, which if you read any Icelandic saga at all, that's probably the one you're going to read. It's one of the classic sagas. And one of the chief protagonists in Njál's saga, Gunnar, his fate is almost tied up with the fate of his dog, as you can see in this. This is a tapestry illustrating scenes from the saga, and it dates from a much later time. But it's a really neat example of the fate of the man and dog being linked together. So Gunnar is the sort of prototypical beautiful Viking man and adventurer, and he has this Irish wolfhound called Sam or Salmer, who is almost as heroic as he is. He's described as a big animal. He will make as good a comrade in arms as a powerful man. He has human intelligence, and he will bark at every man he recognizes as your enemy, but never at your friends. He can tell from a man's face whether he means you well or not. He would lay down his life rather than fail you. And of course, Gunnar, when he's being attacked in his own home, inevitably the men that are attacking him realize that before getting to him, they have to kill his dog. And even though it's quite a beautiful and quite a violent saga with a lot of bloodletting and violence, but the death of this beautiful, loyal watchdog Sam is a really horrible moment that you can read in the saga. And we have, you know, similar kinds of things with other people from Norse history. The King Olaf Tryggvason, he's also reputed to have had a very, very clever dog called Viggy, and Viggy was able to, you know, pick out his own sheep from a whole pen of many, many other people's sheep. And when Olaf was killed, his dog Viggy howled loudly and later climbed onto the king's burial mound and died of starvation. So stories involving Scandinavian dogs don't usually end well for the dog, unfortunately. We're not going to see any of those Viking dogs because they're long gone. But, you know, something that we can see on the tour that's going to Norway next year, it's worth remembering that, you know, someone like Edvard Munch, who I'm sure everyone knows for his famous painting, The Scream, Skriken, he's also painted quite a number of pictures of dogs, as well as horses and cows and geese, hens, ducks, animals from the local zoo. So there's also that kind of nicer aspect of dogs as faithful companions from more recent times. Yeah, so Munch, we're going to the Munch Museum in Oslo, and there's quite a number of his paintings of dogs there, and they're really quite beautiful. Another thing that we will see on the tour as we move to our next topic, which was troll cats. This is a snaffle bit. It's a bit for a horse in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo, dating from the Viking age. And it's got what to me look like cats on the end. You've got sort of a sad cat and a happy cat, really. So Vikings did have cats. They kept cats for companionship. They kept them for their fur. So there's descriptions of particularly witchy kind of women wearing cloaks and caps made of cat fur. And again, you also find cats in the burial mounds. So they were definitely around. In the mythology, we know that Freyja, she rode around in a chariot drawn by cats. So, you know, one of the earliest interpretations of herding cats. No one knows quite how that would work. Thor had a chariot pulled by goats, which again doesn't seem the ideal means of transport. Also from the mythology, there's a story told of the god Thor, who, when he was visiting a giant acquaintance, he was set a number of challenges. And one of the challenges was to try and pick up this huge cat belonging to the giant. And even though Thor was, you know, one of the strongest gods known, he really, really struggled to do this. And he was only able to get one paw of the cat off the ground, and which seems really pathetic until it was later revealed that this cat was in fact the world serpent in disguise. So it was no wonder that Thor was really unable to make much headway with him. But one of the most, I hesitate to say famous because it's actually not all that well known, but one of the most surprising stories about cats is found in the saga of the people of Vatnsdal. And again, this is a tapestry made from a much later time, so it's not an original medieval tapestry. But the saga of the people of Vatnsdal is again one of those classic Icelandic family sagas. And in that saga, you meet this person called Thorolf Sledgehammer, who wasn't particularly popular. He was a sorcerer and wizard, and he owned 20 huge black supernatural cats, and they are described as being all very much under the influence of witchcraft. And it's really not made clear how huge is meant by huge, whether these were kind of oversized pussycats or if they're kind of leopard-like huge cats. But they were certainly terrifying because when people got sick of their local wizard, and they sent 18 men out to raid his house, Thorolf basically set up his cats as a means of defense. And he said, now there are guests to receive, and I intend to have my cats take care of this. And I will put them all outside in the doorway, and the men will be slow to gain entry with them defending the entrance. And he fortified them greatly by magical spells, and again, we have this sound. They became simply ferocious in their caterwauling and blaring and began to behave monstrously and howl. And the 18 men did not dare to attack this place that was defended by these 20 cats. But what they did instead was what Norse assailants typically do when they really run out of ideas. They set fire to the place. Fortunately for the cat lovers amongst us, of which I am very firmly one, the cats as well as Thorolf were able to flee. And it's said in the saga that ever since that place, it's been called Sledgehammer, the place of the sledgehammer. And cats have always been sighted there, and it has always seemed ill-fated since then. So we have these kind of stories. In other sagas, the saga of Roman Gripson, one character who is grappling with a troll sort of says, well, I don't know how a pack of cats got into this mound. So there does seem to be this equation of cats with otherworldliness. In another saga, or a shorter saga, the tale of Orm Sturluson, Orm fights one of his enemies who has taken on the shape of a cat. So there is this kind of association, but it's not really explored in many of the sagas. But it is perhaps what led to the tradition of ghostly ghoul cats in Iceland. If you've been in Iceland around Christmas time, you might have heard or seen the Yule cat. I like the idea that, you know, in English-speaking countries, we have a big, fat, benevolent guy who comes and gives presents to kids. Whereas in Iceland, they have a monstrous giant cat who eats up children who haven't got new clothes for Christmas. And that seems to be part of this long-standing tradition of spectral cats in Iceland, at least. This was even turned into a song by Björk that you might want to listen to later. You can find it on Google, Jólakötturinn, the Yule cat. And she sings about the Yule cat. That cat was huge indeed. And, you know, the various sources that he's found in, he's described as not a very nice beastie, even though inevitably it's become a bit more of a tamer kind of figure in the 21st century, where you're not supposed to scare children so much. So we do have cats popping up here and there in the mythology. One of the places that we unfortunately won't be able to see next year, because it's a really beautiful museum to visit, but it's all being restored and renovated. But if any of you have been to the Viking ship museum in Oslo, you're probably aware with the chariots or the carts that were found in the Oseberg ship. And one of those has many depictions of cats carved into the wood. The Oseberg ship also, as well as having the bodies of two females, it also contained the body of one cat and lots of other sacrificed animals, cows, horses, dogs, even a peacock. So normally in Oslo, we'd be seeing the Viking ship museum, but it's all closed and being restored and rebuilt until it's reopened in a couple of years' time. But something that we will be able to see is the beautiful woodwork of places like Urnes Church. And that's got a magnificent portal which just sneaks in here because you can see this animal here. Some people regard that as a lion. I don't think it's a lion. To me, that looks nothing like a lion. If you want to put a Christian slant on it, you can say it's a lion representing Christ. Probably something like one of the deer that are described in the mythology as nibbling at the foot of the world tree, Yggdrasil, or even perhaps a kind of, you know, serpent or something like that. There's a lot of this serpentine ornamentation during the Viking Age. This is from a buckle from Urnes Church that we will be able to see in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. So yeah, we've got animals described, we've got bodies of animals, and of course, if you come on the tour of Norway, we're even going to be seeing some real animals, a lot of sea animals. So we'll be doing safaris to see things like puffins and sea eagles and whales and so on. And if you kept an eye on the ASA website this year, we did put up a little news article because it's very rare that Norse sagas hit the headlines, and they did with a bang early this year. And the reason that suddenly people were talking about Norse sagas was that it's recently been observed that this process of trap feeding, where whales sort of hover in the water and just keep their mouths open, waiting for fish to swim into them, that was described in the 13th century. It was described in a Norwegian chronicle called The King's Mirror, how there was this mystical sea beast called the Hafgufr, and that it would sort of lie in wait in the same way as these whales have been observed doing. And so it was really nice to see that, you know, some validation being given to these early descriptions, which people had thought was a monster or something that didn't really exist. And it seems that instead they were describing this hunting practice that of the whales that had been unknown up until fairly recently. So whales, of course, are mentioned in a lot of the sagas because whales were important as food, and all their other byproducts, everything in the whale essentially was used. So they're mentioned in several sagas. There are fights over beached whales, and in 2 sagas there are even fights on top of a beached whale. In Grettir's saga, for example, you have this massive battle which takes place over the right of people to get parts of the whale, which involved men beating each other with the tools that they were using to cut up the whale, and one man being beaten to death with a whale rib. I haven't watched Vikings, but it seems that this kind of modern recreation is based on one of those saga descriptions. And the other thing that you find in a number of the sagas is descriptions of whales with human eyes, who can be either benevolent or malevolent. So the whale with human eyes might lead you to the port that you want to go to, or they might make it impossible for you to reach that port. There seems to have been quite an association of humans with sea mammals in a kind of almost, you know, post-humanism, where they could morph into and out of each other. So we have other spectral sea mammals include walruses, which are quite frequently mentioned, and of course seals. And these are some seals that we will actually be seeing on the tour. These seals are at the Lofoten Aquarium. And, you know, when you look at pictures like that, you can actually see where the idea of a seal having human eyes comes from. They were very important to the Viking economy, so there was a lot of seal hunting going on. And we have descriptions in one of the sagas, the saga of Björn, champion of the Heatherdal people, where he's accidentally bitten by a seal, and he tries to keep this secret because it's a bit shameful to be bitten by a seal. But his enemies find out and circulate a series of scurrilous verses, you know, that are called, what was it called? Scratched by a Seal. And the repercussions of that lead to all kinds of escalating court cases and even more frightening outcomes. So, yeah, and we have people in the sagas called things like Helgi Seal's testicle. We have a runic inscription on a sword which belonged to Dumniel Seal's head. In the saga of Torsten Mansionmite, you have this very strange description of a game where people are tossing a seal's head that is flaming hot and dripping with burning tar. That doesn't sound like a very realistic description. And if we go back to Erbygja saga, which I described earlier because it had that kind of enchanted calf, there's also in that saga the description of an enchanted seal. And it's quite a famous description because, again, this seal seems to be the reincarnation of a person who had died, and she's angry because she had told them that she must have her bedclothes burnt, and the householders didn't want to burn her bedclothes because they were so fine. And so she comes up through the floor, and it's almost like a kind of early Icelandic whack-a-mole, because the householders sort of whack the seal back down through the floor, and she will surface again somewhere else, and they get, more and more powerful weapons trying to force her down. Apparently really angry that that her final dying wishes hadn't been respected. So there are these tales of supernatural seals throughout all of Scandinavian folklore. That they can be benevolent, or they can be malevolent. They steal children and take them away, and that kind of thing. So the last animal I wanted to talk about, just briefly, but it's impossible not to. If you think about Norway, you think about the cod. The cod sort of built Norway. The importance of fish to the Norwegian economy really can't be overstated. So this is a sculpture of the cod from Bergen in Norway, where we will be going. Bergen, of course, is a Hanseatic town that relied heavily on the export of dried fish. Thank cod for dried fish, as they say. So we'll be looking at that kind of thing. We'll also be visiting a number of the picturesque fishing villages of the Lofoten Islands, where cod is still dried, outside. It's a protected geographical indication that, they're allowed to dry their cod outside, and it's got its own classification, because high up north is the perfect climate for fish. And it's really, the reason that people were able to live so far north and survive so far north. They are totally reliant on the fish that they were able to catch there. So we'll be seeing that kind of thing. We'll be seeing, all kinds of wonderful birds. If you want to take the funicular to the top of Bergen, you can see the goats that roam there, and we can talk about the goats pulling towards chariot. We'll also be looking at reindeer, which of course are hugely important in the culture of the Sami people, but also important in the culture of the Norse people. For the Norse, the love of false-hearted women is comparable to chasing reindeer over thawing hillsides when you are in love. And another thing that we'll be doing on the tour next year is actually watching a presentation of Peer Gynt, who is, of course, the most famous reindeer herder in all of Norwegian folklore. So there's all kinds of animals, real and imaginary, or even that kind of subtle border between the two, that we'll be able to discuss next year. So thank you very much for listening, and I really hope that some of you will consider joining me on my tour of Norway next year. There's obviously a lot more to say about all of those animals, and the animals that I haven't even mentioned. Well, animals have always been important for people, and they were important then, and they remain really important now. The final thing I wanted to mention was that this year, if you're interested in that kind of thing, if you're interested in Viking Age stuff, I'm blogging about one runic inscription per day. So you can follow that on Facebook, or you can follow it at my website. But there I'm talking about the ornamentation and the texts from the Viking Age and the pre-Viking period and the post-Viking period as well. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Mindy. That was really fascinating. I have been to the Peer Gynt performance, which is a very, very memorable experience. I've done it twice with tour groups, and I'll be doing it again in a month or so's time. And it's a magical evening on the tour. It changes every 2 years. They bring in a completely different group of actors and different settings, and they use the lake, they use the landscape in the most extraordinary ways. So you reminded me of what a very special event that is on the tour. But your tour sounds utterly wonderful. I'm intrigued by all those animals. So thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. And if anyone has questions that they would like to ask Mindy, please go ahead.
I have a question, Mindy. It was fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I mean, I've been enjoying your Runatic posts on your blog, so I highly encourage people to take a look at those. Extraordinary amount of information she conveys in a small paragraph. But my question is, in the United States, and I assume probably throughout most of the Anglophone world, one of the iconographic images of a Viking is the horned helmets. And I'm wondering if that's related to this whole idea of the battle cow.
It's actually wrong, Chris. The Vikings did not wear horned helmets, so that's something that we've got from the whole tradition of Wagner, where they decide. I mean, it looks fantastic. There are horned helmets dating from earlier periods, much earlier periods, but the Vikings did not wear horned helmets. So it would be lovely if they did. Because that's what everyone wants.
Yeah, because it's become the icon, like, you know, from cartoons to even, you know, regular media. Like even in the Viking series, you see them.
Yeah, it's wrong. Yeah, and it's how you convey the essence of a Viking. You put horns on your head, but that's not what actual Vikings did. Yeah, so in all honesty, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I didn't even think of it, because, you know, they didn't wear horned helmets. I didn't actually make that connection. But certainly there are helmets with horns from earlier periods, and I would suggest, yes, of course, they're linked into this whole. Obviously, it's deeply significant in the mythology in a way that is really hard to come at, you know, because we don't really have written text describing their mythology from that time.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, Mindy, if the locals now just have regular contact with dogs and cats and animals without the fear of having them turn into demons.
Yes, I would say so. I mean, one of the stereotypes you hear about Iceland is that, you know, people still believe in elves and still have this kind of belief in the supernatural. You're going to look very, very hard to find someone that believes in an evil seal woman or something like that. You might find the odd one, but I think they're as rational as the rest of the world in this day and age. And so it plays a very important part. You know, it's part of the history. And so, you know, the importance is different, but not perhaps diminished, because, you know, it's still there. And you have a lot of Swedish poems, for example, talking about these kind of figures. But as far as people believing in them, no, I'm going to go no.
Fair enough. And I was in Iceland, and why I asked was I didn't see any dogs or cats when I was there.
Dogs were banned for quite a while in Iceland. They're not banned now, but they were banned for a very long period, yeah. Cats, no. And there's quite a big tradition of ghostly cats. And I think Iceland, they have quite a lot of free roaming cats too. But if you'd looked, you know, if you'd made a special effort looking for them, that you would have found them. They are there, yeah.
Any other questions that anyone would like to ask? Mindy also mentioned the wonderful Edvard Munch Museum in Oslo.
Yes.
Since I was last there, that has moved to very exciting new premises. I think it's been quite a controversial building, but it's certainly a very interesting one. And it's right by the waterfront in Oslo, with an amazing display of Munch paintings. It's much bigger than the old museum was. So I'm very excited about visiting that. And Mindy, I love the painting of the dog that you included by Munch.
Yeah. If you Google Munch and dogs, there's a lot of absolutely beautiful paintings that that people just, well, I was not aware of until we started planning this tour. And yeah, he painted some really gorgeous paintings of a lot of horses and cows, but the dogs are lovely. Yeah, really, really nice. I couldn't find a cat, but I did find the dogs.
And he did those lovely geese, that picture of the girls on the bridge, and there are geese in that. So, yeah, fascinating artist. So any other questions that anyone would like to ask Mindy?
I love the idea of the runes. Did they originally come from that part of the world?
Runic inscriptions originally came from that part of the world. Yeah, little bags of runes are really a 20th century phenomenon. But yeah, I mean, Denmark or northern Germany seems to be the birthplace of runic inscriptions, runic writing.
Could I ask about why do we know that the cow became a frontliner in battle rather than a bull?
Yeah, it's described as a cow. So it's his wonderful cow, Sibylla. And I think one of the different sources was talking about the production of milk. So how important that was, it's difficult to say. But yeah, I call them battle cows because the most important battle cow is in fact a cow, Sibylla. But the bulls also had a prominent role in the mythology.
Most of the illustrations you showed were cows. And it seems quite an interesting change from Taurus bulls, and
it is an interesting change, yeah. And this is why, like, I'm not sure how interesting it is for other people, but for me, the whole idea of this really important status of the cow in mythology is, it's paralleled in other cultures. It's certainly not unique to Norse culture, but it is an interesting one. And some of the ways it's ended up are very strange.
Is the language gendered? I mean, can you tell when you see the words for bovine whether it is talking about a cow or a bull?
Well, if you talk about cattle, it's not always gendered, but otherwise it's going to make clear whether you're talking about a cow or a bull. Yeah. Sibylla is a feminine name, so sometimes if the cow has a name, it will also give you a gender.
Well, Mindy, thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. Thanks to Kristen, our wonderful director of ASA, who puts so much thought and planning into these tours and makes sure that they all happen. We are very fortunate to be leading tours with such a highly professional, organised and also imaginative and thoughtful company. So thank you to ASA once again. So thanks, everyone. See you in a month's time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.